So welcome to the Imperial College Science Festival, and welcome to this series of presentations. I'm kicking off with a presentation about what causes cancer. Obviously, it's not a simple answer. It's an important question, but not a simple answer. And I will start from something you may have either read, the scientific article, or read in the newspapers. A year ago, about a group of very distinguished colleagues in the States, Professor Fogelstein and others, published an article where they found there is a correlation between what is the natural rate of, let's say, errors in DNA replications that occurs in different tissues and rate of cellular replication and the occurrence of cancer in those tissues. They published a very, very, very nice article. It has been known for a long time that the rate of replication and reproduction of different tissues in our body varies a lot. For example, in our GI tract, mouth, pharynx, larynx, esophagus, is very fast because these tissues are exposed to a lot of, let's say, stress and insults from the fact that we eat. So every 3 to 4 days, we basically have a renovation of these tissues. The other extreme, there are the neurons of our brain that since we are born, there is not a new neuron born, there are only neurons dying. So there is a spectrum of speed at which tissue replicates. So the question is this a major factor or not? So in their analysis, they came out by saying this is actually really a major factor in the chance that somebody gets cancer and somebody doesn't get, and in short, it was called bad luck. What I'm trying to do now is to argue that while this is an important biological component that determines why we get certain cancer rather than others in different parts of our body, it's actually a much more modest component in terms of what we can do to prevent cancer. And let's see. So I will go to 6, 7 points in my presentation. One is the fundamental starting point. For all diseases, a key element that guides us to understand the causes is the frequency in different populations. To the extreme, for some infectious diseases, we know that they are only present in some part of the world and not in other parts of the world. And then we know that the virus or the parasite or the bacteria is actually present only there. This goes back to 100 years ago of infectious disease epidemiology. But also for what we call chronic diseases, so cancer, cardiovascular, diabetes. To know that the disease frequency varies between population has been used over the past 50, 60 years as a major guide to understand what might cause, because if a disease is very rare in one population but very frequent in the other, you start looking what is the difference between these two areas. For cancer, the specific type of cancer have huge variations around the planet. What you see now, I'm going to show you 3 or 4 slides. This is the total incidence of cancer, and red is where it's more frequent, and green is where it's less frequent. So you will see that in all what is in red, cancer is about 4 to 5 times more frequent than where it's in green. And it's not that where you see the green is because we are unable to measure cancer. We are very able to measure cancer. There are very specialized systems that we call population-based cancer registries that measure the frequency of cancer. So there is a real huge variation of overall cancer incidence. But the variation is even more extreme when we look at specific cancers. For example, colorectal cancer is about 5, 6 times, up to 10 times more frequent in, let's say, North America, Europe, and Australia, compared to Southeast Asia, China, India, and all the, let's say, African continent. So there must be something, that is different there, which has nothing to do with the rate at which our cell replicates. You may wonder, is the genetic factors? And just I clarify this from the beginning. And the answer is no. There are genetic factors, but generally they don't explain differences between populations. Because we have done a lot of studies over the past 20 years on what we call the migrants population. For example, let's say Japanese from Japan moved to Hawaii. Japan used to have one of the lowest incidence of colorectal cancer in the planet. It was about 10 times less frequent than UK 30 years ago. The Japanese who moved to Hawaii, obviously they moved with their genes, but in a different environment. And now the Japanese in Hawaii have the highest incidence of colorectal cancer in the world. And there are a number of other situations like this. Also in the positive sense, let's say Italians from the north of Italy with a high incidence of stomach cancer migrated to Australia, and within a generation they acquired the same incidence of the local population. I should say that whatever you can think of the British diet, England has the lowest incidence in the world of stomach cancer. So there must be something right there. And breast cancer is very much the same picture as colorectal cancer. Very high incidence wherever, let's say, the Europeans have spread around the planet. Stomach cancer is exactly the opposite image. You see, what was green or red now is red. Basically, stomach cancer used to be the most common cancer around the planet until 1800, 150 years ago. Was the most common cancer in Europe, for example. And has progressively been declining as hygiene has improved. We know that it's related to chronic infection of Helicobacter pylori, has decreased as the chain of cold, the cold chain for food has replaced salt. Salt was the main way of preserving food for centuries, until when it has been replaced by the cold and by the refrigerators. So we know that the spread of refrigerators in different countries is highly correlated with the decrease in stomach cancer. You can say also the spread of television is correlated with but it's not the same story, because we know for sure that salt is a major, salt preserved foods are a component. So we know that there are huge variations there. If we now take a big picture, instead of looking at countries, we divide the world in a kind of let's say, imprecise way, but in less developed, economically developed regions and more developed economical regions. What you see there is that depending on the cancer may be many more times frequent in the more developed regions, like lung, breast, colorectal, and prostate. But then when you go to liver, it's much more frequent. This is frequency, it's not number of cases, frequency. Much more frequent in less developed regions, because is where hepatitis B is much more prevalent, and exposure to other food contaminants, like a particular group of contaminants that are relevant for grains, aflatoxins that are produced by molds. You see, for example, esophageal cancer, much more frequent in poor countries, esophageal, where people don't drink alcohol. Is very much related to having a very poor diet, no fresh fruits, no fresh vegetables, staple foods. So all this has all to do of where we live. You can go down here and see the variations. Now, what has been happening in the last 50 years? We all know about the climate change. We all know about the big changes in the environment. But we tend to forget that we, human beings, have changed enormously. And we have changed with our same genes. Our genes have not changed. So this is the height of young men around age 20 at the entry in the military service in the countries that you can read there. In 150 years, in most populations, men have now taken, let's say, grown 20 centimeters taller. There is a big analysis we just submitted for publication, actually it's going to be published, which is called The Height of the World, where we have analyzed that the trend of height over the past 100 years around the planet So the women in South Korea are the women who have grown mostly, have gained 23 centimeters in 80 years. 23 centimeters. So that the genes are the same. So there are huge changes, which means better availability of food, more protein in young age, less infections, and people achieve what we call the genetically possible or predetermined height. So we are born all with the possibility to grow up to a given point. If you get better diet, more protein, more food when you are young, then you reach that genetically determined height. And why I say this? Well, because taller people have higher risk of getting cancer. There has been a number of studies, very large around the planet. Just being taller comes with a 20% higher chance, or bad luck, of getting cancer. But don't be worried if you are tall, because taller people have a 30% lower probability of dying of myocardial infarction. And this has been seen all around the planet. So something that happens in the first 20 years of our life as an imprint of our body will develop and grow. This is the age at which women develop menarche, so have their first menses, sexual maturation. Gigantic decrease. Again, we think that the same factors that stimulate height stimulate early menarche, better diet, more rapid physical development, sexual development. Why it's relevant? It's relevant because the younger is a girl, when she complete, or if she starts sexual maturation, she starts having menses, the higher will be her risk of breast cancer 30, 40 years later. It's about 20, 30%, 40% increase in the probability of getting cancer later on in life. We understand a little bit why. Early sexual maturation, something happens at the level of the hormonal control of the gland, of the mammary gland, and that is a kind of imprint message that stays there. Very difficult, obviously, to change this, but it's an important background factor. Now, we all know about the epidemic of smoking, and we all know about the epidemic of obesity. Maybe I don't know to what extent we know quantitatively how massive it is. So in the 1980s, there were about 500 million of people overweight in the planet. Now it's 1.5 billion, and all the regions of the planet are equally, more or less equally concerned. There were about 120 million people who were obese, which means with a body mass index more than 30. And now it's 500 million, so which basically says that today we have 2 billion people around the planet who are overweight or obese. And why this is relevant? Because if there is something really a breakthrough of the past 4, 5, 6 years, is the evidence that being overweight is not only bad because it increases your risk of getting diabetes, or getting cardiovascular diseases, myocardial infarction, and a number of other unpleasant conditions, but it also increases the risk of getting a number of cancers. And overall, cancer incidence is about 20, 30% higher among obese people compared to lean people. Again, it's something that is environmental, is something that is related to lifestyle, and the good news is that something that we can change. The question is how we have accumulated all the information I've been sharing with you now, and many more that I will share in a moment now. Well, there's been, in the past 15 or 20 years, a series of very large population studies. Instead of working only in the lab on biological models, cancer researchers have moved out in the population with the idea that if you study a very large population, collect a lot of information of people who don't have a disease, collect biological samples, and you then follow them up, you will be able to link what you have measured, the baseline, when people were healthy, and with the risk of getting the disease later. This is what we call prospective cohort study. Cohort comes from the Latin, as you know, word for a group of military people that were created and then would move on and go to battle all together and not be replaced. So 18 years ago, I started this study, which is called EPIC, where we collected data on 500,000 people, and we collected biological samples, particularly blood samples, from over 400,000. We've been now following these people for 15, 16 years. 90,000 of the original 500,000 developed cancer. So we have now been working over the past decade to understand what, among the factors we measured at the beginning, lifestyle, diet, physical activity, anthropometry, smoking, alcohol, sexual life, everything was possible to measure. We didn't measure it. What is related to the risk of developing cancer later on, and how the biological samples we have collected can help us to understand why. Because as you know, there is a difference between a correlation between a risk factor and the disease, and the fact that that factor is causally related to the disease, which is very, very important. I was joking before about the number of TV sets in a household, but obviously if you measure the number of TV sets in a household, it correlates to a number of diseases around the planet, but whatever you can think about a TV is not causing cancer, let's put it this way. So that is an important combination of lab research with population research that is now, let's say, we're now using very extensively. So as I said, we collected blood samples. Just to give you an idea of the scale, we have stored 9 million single aliquots of blood, which means that there are 2 or 3 rooms like this where blood samples are stored for this project. In the rest of my talk, just as I have to be focused, obviously, and stay within the time, I will just talk briefly about 2 cancers plus 1 disease, and then try to have some optimistic closure on preventability. On colorectal cancer, we just showed a moment ago that colorectal cancer is much more common in Europe, North America, Australia, and somewhere in South America where let's say, Europeans moved there. So the question is why? And I have only one slide for colorectal cancer, because it's one of those cancers for which we know almost, it's pretentious what I'm saying, almost everything. In the sense that we now know a number of factors that either prevent or cause colorectal cancer, at the point that the next step of research on colorectal cancer is to intervene and see whether we can prevent it. So these factors, plus some genetic predisposition, explain over 80% of the variation in the risk of getting cancer. What we have there? Well, we have fruit, vegetables, whole cereals, fibers, folates contained in food, and vitamin D that you can get by exposing yourself to the sunlight, or today is a very nice day for vitamin D, or to take supplements. All this will reduce your risk of getting colorectal cancer. Unfortunately, there are foods that, whether you like them or not, are associated with an increased risk. It's not dramatic, 20–30% increased risk, but consumption of red meat, where red meat means beef, pork, and lamb, is associated with an increased risk of colorectal cancer, and all processed meat, where processed meat means any kind of this meat, essentially pork meat, salted and preserved. Again, it's not like smoking. Smoking multiplies your risk of cancer by 40 times. Meat and processed meat, there was a lot on the media recently, increase your risk of 1.2. So it's not 40, it's 20%. But everything counts. What you have on the right is the discovery of the last few years. Thanks to this study, we found out that being obese, overweight obese, being physically inactive, and having a metabolic condition which we call insulin resistance increase the risk. What is insulin resistance? The pancreas produces the insulin to obviously metabolize and use glucose. And the problem is that if you gain weight, if you are very sedentary, in most instances, you develop what is called insulin resistance, which means you need more insulin to use your glucose. It's called a pre-diabetic condition. We found 10 years ago that being in this pre-diabetic condition, which is very frequent, is 20% of our population, people sitting in this room probably, 20%, increases by 50, 60, 70% your risk of getting colorectal cancer, and even more postmenopausal breast cancer. So the good news is that we can do something, because these are all factors on which we can operate. We can promote consumption of some foods, moderate consumption of other foods, increase physical activity, fight obesity, and are modifiable factors. So in public health, we like modifiable factors, because it's there that we have an opportunity to intervene. Breast cancer. Again, for breast cancer, we saw that there were big variations. Now, in breast cancer, and I'll try now to be very simple in what I'm saying here. The big problem for breast cancer is that we also found a lot of risk factors, but most of these risk factors are, let's say, from a social point of view, not modifiable. Why? Because there are conditions that increase of 2, 3, 4 times the risk of a woman to get breast cancer in between age 40 and 80, let's say. And these are all related to reproductive life. For example, I just said before, age of sexual maturation, early age, higher risk. Age at the first full-term pregnancy, a full-term pregnancy before age 20, reduced by substantially the risk of getting breast cancer compared to a first pregnancy after age 25 or 30. So the current trend of postponing the first pregnancy contributes to increase the incidence of breast cancer. But it's what we call the non-modifiable, because that would imply a huge change in the society. Number of children, 3, 4, 5 pregnancies of children, it reduced the risk of breast cancer compared to having only 1 or 2. Even more complicated, the age of the last pregnancy. If the last pregnancy is late, after age 40, or any pregnancy at age 40, increases the risk of breast cancer. So all these are factors that are related to change in the society, and as from a public health point of view, we don't touch them. So what can we touch? Well, what we can touch is what is related to metabolism, lifestyle, anthropometry, physical activity, and a few other factors like taking hormones after menopause, which does increase the risk of breast cancer. In breast cancer now, we have a very good understanding on how obesity, for example, causes the increase of risk of breast cancer after menopause. I'm not going in the details of what is there, but again, all turns around this concept of the insulin resistance. So the dysregulation by which our body requires more insulin to use glucose. And then we have too much insulin around, and the insulin has, when it's too much, has a number of disruptive effects on a number of biological systems and cell cycles. The end result of having too much insulin is that the body will produce more estrogens, and will produce more estrogens which are biologically available. So too much estrogens that are biologically available, that bombard the mammary glands, more cancer. So anything which ends up by having more estrogens is a risk factor for breast cancer. And this is supported by our studies, by studies done by other colleagues, Harvard University, study done by Imperial College, where we have found, this graph means that what we have found is that the higher is the level of estrogens and to some extent the androgens in the blood, the higher is the risk of developing breast cancer. So within the level of normality, which is very important, within the range of normality, just having the higher level of estrogens multiplies by 2, twofold increase, which is 200% increase of the risk of getting breast cancer after age 45. I'm just tempted to touch on what is the green light down there, because it's very important. It links breast cancer to lifestyle again. This SHBG stands for sex hormone binding globulin. So our hormones, our steroid hormones, are circulating in our blood in a way that they are, let's say, 98% of what we circulate in the blood is biologically inactive. We have very often in our body these systems where we have a surplus of what we need, so we have a reserve. And for estradiol and estrone, we have a 98% reserve, particularly, I'm talking about women here. So this 2% is the one which is biologically active, and is regulated by this sex hormone binding globulin. So it's a globulin, it's a type of protein produced by the liver. Why is so important? Because this globulin, the production in the liver, is regulated by the insulin produced by the pancreas. The blood from the pancreas goes to the liver, and it's like a continuous regulation. More insulin, less sex hormone binding globulin, less insulin, more SHBG. Why we have this system? We have this system because in the evolution over tens of thousands of years, it has happened that this system protects women from becoming pregnant when they are malnourished. How it works? Well, if let's imagine a starving condition, very little food, the pancreas has no reason to produce insulin, right? Because there is nothing to digest, no sugar to digest. So the insulin level goes down. If the insulin level goes down, the liver is free to produce a lot of sex hormone binding globulin. The sex hormone binding globulin binds the estrogens. Binding the estrogens, estrogen becomes unavailable biologically. Therefore, women stop menstruating and stop ovulating. Therefore, a starving woman is very unlikely to become pregnant. Evolution tells us that probably 30, 40, 50, 60, 100 years ago in primates, all the women who did not have this mechanism were becoming pregnant, were more likely to have no descendants, because then the fetus will die or the woman will die during labor. So we have all been selected to maximize our chances of reproducing ourselves when we have enough food to reproduce ourselves. This is great. The problem is that when we have too much food, then we have too much, let's say, too much insulin, then we have too much bioavailable estrogens and androgens, and that's the problem. By the way, what all the story I said is very well used in clinical practice for young girls who have anorexia nervosa, the condition by which young girls stop eating. I say girls because 90% is girls. But, and now this sex hormone binding globulin is used, the measurement, to see when the treatment works. If the treatment works, girls start eating for real, and their insulin will go up, and therefore the SHBG will go down, and they will start ovulating again. So this is how a normal mechanism that is there to protect ourselves in our reproduction has turned into something which is negative in some conditions. This was about the story. I go to the next one. So the disease X is what I present to my students when I see that they start falling asleep. And as a test, let's say, let's imagine you have a disease where a disease is more frequent, the risk is higher. For people who have high triglyceride, that's what your GP would ask you to test. Occasionally, if they have higher level of glycemia, like people with diabetes. But the disease is lower if people have more of the good cholesterol, the HDL cholesterol. So the question is, which is this disease which is associated with glycemia, triglycerides, and HDL cholesterol. So usually some of the students wake up and say, is diabetes, is myocardial infarction, or something like that. No, it's endometrial cancer. Endometrial cancer is, among all the cancers, the one which is more strongly related, very strongly related, to diet, obesity, and to the same pattern of metabolic conditions that predispose to get myocardial infarction, cardiovascular diseases, and type 2 diabetes. It was actually the first cancer that was found to be clearly associated with obesity more than 30 years ago. Are these the causes? Are these causes of breast cancer, of endometrial cancer? Clearly not. Cholesterol is related to atherogenesis and to myocardial infarction, but is not related to endometrial cancer. What is the real cause is, again, our estradiol. High level of estrogens in blood and high level, now we know what it is. Free means biologically active. Estradiol are the real risk factors. So women with a relatively high but yet normal level of estradiol have a fourfold increase of risk of developing endometrial cancer in their life. Now, having said all that, is there any chance that we can do anything about it? This was a good question that we were asked a few years ago by Science and Science Journal, and they said, "Can you?" The challenge was, can you write in 4 pages a strong argument in favor of prevention? Is there any chance to demonstrate that prevention works? Well, I just show you here a couple of arguments, 2 actually, where prevention has worked, but there are many, many more. So this is what I would call is one of the best success story of modern medicine around the planet. And this is the decrease in mortality for cardiovascular diseases. Most of it is myocardial infarction. Over the past 40, 50 years, has been gigantic. It's the main reason why we live longer, why there is a longer life expectancy, because cardiovascular disease mortality has gone down and is now only 20% of what used to be 40 or 50 years ago. And this has been not by chance. It's been a combination of factors. It's been change in the manufacturing of food. You don't realize that, but there are much less saturated fat in the food we eat now than in the food that we were eating 50 years ago, 60 years ago. Much more availability of fresh products like fruit and vegetables. You don't realize, but there is a huge change in what we eat. All started, for example, in some countries like Finland, is the top there, that had a very high mortality, and they modified radically in the 80s the type of food that they propose. Now, cholesterol is lower in the Finnish population than in Italy. So there is, Italy and Spain are always cited as Greece as the Mediterranean country, the ideal place with a wonderful diet where people eat fruit and vegetables, pasta, and then spend the time sitting in a bar drinking a coffee. And this is why they don't get any disease, because they don't do anything. Now, besides all these factors, there is a huge power that the states have in public health, in improving things. About 1/3 or 40% of this is due to the improvement of treatment of the acute myocardial infarction, which is a good story. Now, this is the mortality for lung cancer. You can look, for example, at the red line, which is UK. On the left, you have men, right? You have women. Let's focus on men for a second. So we all know about the epidemic of smoking. We all know that in this country where we are now, in the early 50s, 80% of men were smoking somehow, somewhat. 80%. The consequence was a tremendously high increase of mortality for lung cancer, which is what you see there. You see it for UK, for example, for the Netherlands, which may not be well known, Eastern Europe with Hungary, and so on. What happened is that in the 70s, there's been a shift in habits. So middle-aged and older men started, let's say, stopping smoking, so became ex-smokers. And the beauty of the story is that within 4 or 5 years after you stop smoking, hopefully you don't smoke, but people who do smoke, the risk, the probability of getting lung cancer starts dropping. So there is a, contrary to common perception, people say, oh, I've been smoking for 20 years, doesn't make any difference if I stop. Completely wrong. At any age, people stop smoking. Even if they are 60, 65, 70, their risk of getting lung cancer will start going down 3, 4, 5 years after they stop smoking. So this has been a success story. We have saved, let's say, we have prevented hundreds of thousands of premature death occurring around Europe and around many countries in the world. Now we are down to 15% smokers in some countries around the planet, and hopefully we'll go down to less than 10%. What you see on the right is the different scale is that unfortunately, as there are less men smoking, there are more women proportionally smoking. So there was a big difference in the prevalence of smoking between men and women, and now tends to be, has happened like this. Men has gone down and women has gone up. It's about the same. So there is more to do about women. This is my second last slide. And so if we go from cancer to, let's say, to something which is very important for all of us, because we only die once. And so ideally, you would like to, to see what improve your chances of living longer in good health, right? So this is based on EPIC. It's just been accepted for publication, are brand new results. First time this type of analysis is ever done. What do we see there? We have taken a model based on 500,000 people and 60,000 deaths. You just take people who are alive at age 40-ish, 45, and you say, okay, those who are alive at age 45, what is their probability, of dying or being alive by age 70, 75? And we have summarized here in 4 groups. The green line, men and women, are the people who never smoked and who have a relatively healthy lifestyle, which means that they are not obese, have a balanced diet, physically active, and a few other things. So all things that have to do with your behavior. So the good news is that if you are 45 and you have all these characteristics, you have 95% chances of being alive at age 75. It's not bad. 95% chances. However, if you take the worst case scenario, which means you are a smoker, you are overweight, you have a poor diet, you have high blood pressure, and a couple of other things, you have only 65% chance of being alive by age 75. Obviously, the probability of being alive at age 120 is 0. So that's clear. But all what we are dealing with is what happens between age 45, when most people are still alive, and age 90, 100, by when most people will be dead. And what has happened in the last 20 years is that this has moved, the high probability of dying around age 50 to 60 has now moved to age 70 to 80. This is why, this is obvious, means we live longer because we don't die in middle age. So the decrease in smoking is fantastic because it brings the people from the lower curve to the upper curve. What is absolutely new here is that what we have seen is that if non-smokers are unhealthy, their probability of being alive is almost as good or as bad as people who are smokers but are healthy for everything else. It's different to think that the healthy smokers. But it is someone who smokes, but despite smoking, is lean, physically active, has a good diet, and so on and so on. So this says that just telling people don't smoke is good, but it's not enough. We have to tell people don't smoke and try to have all these other healthy characteristics that will increase your chances to reach an older age in a good health. And why this is important? Because if you go beyond the borders of London, UK, Europe, and you look at the planet, so this is a study we have done looking at the 58 million people who die around the planet every year, and we have attributed the cause of death to the underlying risk factors. Which is the #1 killer today in the world? Is high blood pressure. Because in Asia, in South America, high blood pressure has gone out of control. There is a very high prevalence of high blood pressure and very poor treatment. It kills more than in number of millions of people. It kills almost 8 million people, high blood pressure, through what it causes. Second is tobacco, and we understand that is going down in Europe, but it's going up in many other countries. And the third one is what I told you before when I say insulin resistance, is high blood glucose, which does not mean diabetes, means being these borderline conditions of high blood glucose, poor glycemia control. Physical inactivity, almost 4 million people, high body mass, which is overweight, obesity, and cholesterol, alcohol, and so on. And again, the good news is that all these factors are modifiable. And this is what we are working on in our Imperial College School of Public Health, which is part of the medical school, and where we are working on infectious disease, chronic disease. We try to understand causes of disease, and then finally we try to understand how we can prevent disease. Thank you for your attention. Is there one question?
Yeah. You showed the benefit of low food intake for women. The evolution and binding the hormone and all the rest of it. There's been publicity recently about the 5-2 diet. Do you recommend, or do you see any trend for the impact of eating less, even though we can afford to eat more, on male longevity?
Absolutely. The question is that what you eat has to be in, let's say, in balance with how much energy you spend. So one can be extremely healthy by eating 6,000 kilocalories a day if you every day run 10 miles. So the question is that the balance between energy in and energy out, energy in from food and energy out from physical activity should be balanced. Let's say the epidemic of obesity is due to the combination of a huge reduction in physical activity, because we have to do different type of jobs. 80% of the economy in UK is service, right? So, which means that there used to be millions of people doing physical work that don't do physical work anymore. With the huge availability of food, so the two combined largely explain the epidemic of obesity. Was another question there? Yes.
I wanted to ask you if you could care to comment about the relationship between hormone replacement therapy and the increase in breast cancer.
So this is a very delicate question, because obviously there are advantages in offered by hormone replacement therapy, better quality of life. In general, there are better bone health. So there are clear advantages. There is a slight reduction in cardiovascular disease risk. However, there is a clear, there is no doubt about that, increased risk of developing breast cancer. So now, let's say the association is so strong that in the United States, if you just look at the time trends of breast cancer incidence, when 10 years ago this became known, and there was a huge reduction in prescription of HRT, the incidence of breast cancer declined by 10–15% at the national level, and now it's a new plateau. So the question is, if women take HRT, should make sure that they have a mammography, that they have a proper follow-up for early detection of breast cancer in case this develops. combination. Thank you.
Thank